There we go. So this is our last installment for now of God and the Bard, and I'm sure I might be asked to make a guest appearance again, maybe at some point. Tom's nodding vaguely. So I wanted to examine here what the link was between sin, evil, and temptation in Othello. So I'm hoping that this will be food for thought. We've got our usual Q&A, of course, at the end as well. So I'll get to it. I'll get to it. Okie dokie. So I am not what I am. Sin, evil, and the temptation in Othello. There are few things as fascinating and compelling to us as evil and the slide into it. Whether it is Netflix documentaries on serial killers, podcasts on 20th century dictators, or 24/7 breaking news on powerful men who have abused their status and privilege, we are almost pathologically enticed by the prospect of pushing our noses up against the glass, getting up really close and personal with someone who has done something horrific. The form in which evil and its temptation can appear differs greatly across time and cultures. Sometimes it is a megalomaniac leader with a supposedly utopian aim that he will get to no matter what, dragging his people with him, kicking and screaming, if he has to, justifying every moment of tyranny as being for the greater good. Sometimes it is a group of people who turn on one another, remain silent or look the other way while others are persecuted, often fatally, also justifying their behaviour as being for the benefit of their society. And very, very occasionally, it is an overly chatty serpent hanging out in a fruit tree in Mesopotamia, making conversation with a bored housewife. Shakespeare's Othello is one of literature's greatest explorations of sin, temptation, and evil. And Shakespeare does this through the exploration of the relationship between two of the best roles in all classical theatre, our protagonist Othello and his antagonist Iago. While the play may be named after its noble but jealous hero, it is his brother-in-arms Iago who is arguably the centre of the play. A man so compellingly awful that audiences often leave the theatre talking more about him than anyone else. How could he do what he did, destroying the lives of so many people, and that he effected it just through talking to them? And is that enough to make him evil? So, a quick plot summary for you. Othello, a black general in Venice, marries the beautiful and loyal Desdemona without her father's permission. Desdemona is white. His officer, Iago, furious that he has been passed over for promotion in favour of the more sophisticated Cassio, plots revenge against Othello, using Cassio as a pawn. Iago convinces Othello that Desdemona is having an affair with Cassio, even though it is a lie. Believing Iago's deceit, Othello abuses Desdemona verbally and physically before he is completely overcome with jealousy and suspicion, and he smothers her fatally in bed. Overcome with grief at his actions and horror at Iago's deception, which comes to light at the end of the play, Othello stabs himself and Iago is arrested, awaiting punishment. The play has been perennially popular, and many great actors have taken on the role, which demands both romanticism and brutality. For the first 200 years of the play's performance history, all Othellos were white. The first black actor to take on the role was Ira Aldridge. You can see him there in the top left in a wonderful photo in full costume as Othello. He was a New Yorker by birth with a passion for acting, but it being the early 1800s, he could find no outlet in his home country for his talents. So he emigrated to Britain, and he played Othello in many cities here for years to great acclaim. Paul Robeson, on the bottom middle there, later played the role in the 1930s, and the interracial kisses that were performed every night on stage caused a sensation in a still segregated country. It was his belief that Othello is a part which has dignity for the Negro actor, and that my people would be very proud of any Negro actor appearing in such a part. The audiences must have agreed with him, as he received 20 curtain calls on opening night. Other actors to take on the role include David Harewood, Denzel Washington, Lawrence Fishburne, Hugh Quashie, James Earl Jones, and even Patrick Stewart in the so-called photo-negative production in the US in the 90s. You can see a picture there on the bottom right, where he was the sole white actor and all the rest of the cast was black. Yet at its core, the play is not really just a study of racism, nor even of marital jealousy. Instead, another tantalizing question presents itself. What exactly is the nature of temptation and evil? How does it manifest? And why did Iago do what he did? Christianity has one explanation for this. According to the doctrine of original sin, we are born sick and broken, but with the option of salvation through God. However, we are also made with the ability to make choices, even if that means choosing to reject God. As seen in the Garden of Eden, evil rarely needs to use force or threat to entice people to sin. It merely exploits existing weaknesses. The serpent did not say to Eve, "You must eat the fruit." He simply asked questions, created doubt, invited Eve to reinterpret what she already knew. If humans are in a constant struggle to balance their will, reason, and passions, then evil can find all sorts of chinks in our armour, just as the serpent did. It is this element that Iago exploits so successfully in Othello. At the start of the play, Iago lays out his grievances at the Moor to Roderigo, a former suitor of Desdemona's, and they are the same grievances that Macbeth had: a lack of promotion and recognition of his years of service, and resentment at being supplanted by a higher status man with markedly less military experience. Iago resentfully describes Cassio as having never set a squadron in the field. Mere prattle without practice is all his soldiership, but he, sir, had the election. But unlike Macbeth, who fantasizes about murdering his king to gain his crown, Iago harbours no such ambitions. Even though he feels aggrieved at being passed over to be Othello's right-hand man, that grievance does not mean Iago wants Othello's job, nor even really the position that Cassio now occupies. It is the knock to his honour and pride that he simply cannot forgive. In the same way that the great warrior Achilles in the Iliad, furious that his commander has taken his war booty and refuses to re-enter the battle, even if Agamemnon gave him back all the treasure, because the slight to Achilles' honour cannot be fixed, undone, or truly apologised for until it is evened dishonour for dishonour. Iago feels similarly. His is a far more deep-seated resentment, like that of Achilles, that manifests itself in that most childish of impulses, the need to get even. And how does he do this? The same way the serpent did in Eden, asking questions, misdirecting, reframing events to warp another person's perception of reality. Iago bides his time, carefully moving all the chess pieces until the board is set. He engineers a scenario where Cassio gets drunk and starts fighting with others, which of course causes him to lose his new job as Othello's lieutenant. Othello himself sacks him. Yet Iago is not immediately promoted. More must be done before that honour can be bestowed. Desperately unhappy at the loss of his status and reputation, Cassio approaches Desdemona on Iago's advice as, according to the latter, our general's wife is now the general. Desdemona, innocently and earnestly, promises Cassio that she will plead for him to Othello, begging her husband to take Cassio back into his good graces. But, embarrassed at his drunken outburst and somewhat emasculated by it, Cassio does not wish to be in Othello's company while Desdemona pleads for him, so he dashes off, which Othello and Iago see, and she pleads for Cassio to Othello, again in front of Iago. This sets the scene for the temptation to occur, where Iago invites Othello to reconsider something he had previously regarded as certain, much like Eve and the fruit. But while Iago's aim may be to put Othello into a jealousy so strong that judgment cannot cure it, it would seem that he recognises that same monster in himself. Earlier on in the play, Iago offers us another excuse as to why he may be seeking revenge. That I do suspect the lusty Moor hath leapt into my seat, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my innards, and nothing can or shall content my soul till I am evened with him, wife for wife. He thinks that Othello has taken his place in the marital bed and slept with his wife, Emilia. To be clear, he has no basis for this. It is not true, and neither his wife nor his general have ever given him cause to believe it, but it is a very convenient pretext. In this description, Iago reduces Othello to a creature of desire. Not only does the line "lusty Moor hath leapt" connote sexual vigour, but it also suggests uncontrolled appetite and animalistic desires, which are innately the result of his blackness, according to Iago. The constant reference to Othello as the Moor dehumanises and fetishises him further, as well as rehearsing contemporary attitudes of white Europeans that associated blackness of skin with looseness of character. The term Moor was used to refer to the peoples of the Maghreb region of North Africa, in what we would now call Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia, as well as the Muslim inhabitants of Sicily, Malta, and Spain during the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, Moor was used to describe any person with brown to black skin. Now, Elizabethans made the distinction between white Moors, who were what we would call light-skinned Arabs, like the image here on the right of the Moorish ambassador to Elizabeth I, and between black Moors, as seen on the left here, who were black-skinned. Variations of the term still appear in Latinate languages. In Italian and Spanish, moro; in French, moor; Portuguese, muro; Romanian, Moor. There has been some doubt as to whether Othello was a brown-skinned Maghrebi or a black-skinned sub-Saharan African, but due to references in the text to him being the thick lips, this would point more towards black sub-Saharan African physiognomy. Jews and Moors had been expelled from England by the time Shakespeare was writing Othello in 1604. In fact, Queen Elizabeth I had issued proclamations against Negroes and blackamoors in 1596 and again in 1601, claiming that these individuals consumed too much food during times of scarcity and were infidels. Obviously, blaming immigrants for a country's problems is not new. But the mandates required the consent of their English masters, and because the masters largely refused to cooperate, the attempted deportation schemes failed. The few black Moors who were part of English society were largely exhibited as curiosities or used as slaves. Foreigners in general, and Moors and Jews specifically, were mistrusted because they were perceived as a threat to the cultural uniformity of England. So for Shakespeare to make a blackamoor the protagonist in one of his greatest tragedies would have been deeply confronting and powerful, and would suggest that Shakespeare does not agree with his antagonist's negative view of it. In referring constantly to Othello's race and supposed sexual prowess, Iago strips away Othello's intellect and emotional depth, and removes his undeniable military merit, reducing him to nothing more than a hypersexual creature. It seems this attitude has had a remarkably long shelf life, as the stereotype of the hypersexed black man still exists today, which of course has allowed white power structures to justify extreme violence and surveillance against black men under the guise of protecting white women. But the lusty Moor description also reveals something crucial about Iago. By latching on to the lazy stereotype that black men possess an unmatchable predatory sexual appetite, this gives Iago the permission he craves to avoid confronting his own shortcomings as a husband and as a soldier. Iago therefore positions himself as a self-righteous avenger, getting even with Othello wife for wife, an almost exact parallel of the Old Testament's eye for an eye and Achilles' dishonour for dishonour. Rather like the scorpions that infect Macbeth's mind, Iago's mind has a poisonous substance buried deep within it that gnaws at him, and this suspicion of infidelity is enough to drive him. He already feels that others have taken his place professionally speaking. Now he tells himself that he has been supplanted sexually too. He is suffering with the same affliction he will mete out to Othello, and this is Iago's horrific genius. He doesn't just invent the sin, he teaches Othello to sin in his own image. Iago's first movement towards temptation in Act 3 is an almost comical remark. "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy! It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on." The image of a monster ready to devour and ridicule at once is a devastating one. It is both a predator and a parasite. The irony is clear. Iago introduces the very monster he warns Othello against, disguising temptation as moral virtue. Shakespeare makes Iago seem like a wise counsellor, and the more virtuous he seems, the more sinister his manipulation becomes. The Lord's Prayer asks, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." But unfortunately, this is exactly what is happening. And Iago's next image makes the temptation even more theological. "Good heaven, the souls of all my tribe defend from jealousy." Here, Iago is performing piety. He invokes heaven as though he himself is threatened by the very sin he is deliberately producing in Othello. This is characteristic of Shakespeare's treatment of evil throughout the play, evil frequently disguising itself as moral concern. Iago doesn't tempt Othello by saying, "Be wicked." He tempts him by saying, "I'm worried about you." And that is far more dangerous. How many of us have fallen for such a line? How many of us have failed to notice malicious or undermining behaviour from our so-called loved ones because we thought that they cared for us and had our best interests at heart? The thought that someone we care for might not only not care in return, but might be jealous of us to such an extent that they actively seek to undermine and undercut us is a devastating realisation, and yet it has happened to all of us. Iago observes in Act 1, "I am not what I am," and we have all been on the receiving end of somebody who wasn't what we thought they were. Now, for years, I have had students asking me, why on earth is Othello so quick to believe Iago? To the calm, dispassionate observer, it's a good question. But when one is in the middle of it and our emotions and hearts are on the line, often our heads do not remain balanced, and we can hang our whole world upon the smallest suspicion. And it is often overlooked that Othello does, in fact, resist Iago's efforts, at first. He gives Iago a very mature response. Thinkest thou I'd make a life of jealousy, to follow still the changes of the moon with fresh suspicions? No! To be once in doubt is once to be resolved. He then goes on to insist that his wife's good qualities are not grounds for jealousy nor suspicion, and that her choice of him speaks well of her, stating, Nor from mine own weak merits will I draw the smallest fear or doubt of her revolt, for she had eyes and chose me. No, Iago, I'll see before I doubt. When I doubt, prove. Othello recognises her choice of him as meaningful and pushes back on the narrative that her father and Iago have pushed, that Desdemona could not possibly have fallen in love with what she feared to look upon. This particular line of argument gets weaker and weaker by the day, especially in light of modern performances, where the tendency now is to cast very handsome young black men in the title role, rather than the paternal, aged white men in blackface that were the norm in the 20th century. You can see here Laurence Olivier, Orson Welles, and John Gielgud on the right, compared with Adrian Lester, Andre Holland, and David Oyelowo on the left. While there are obvious parallels with the Eve situation, Othello differs from Eve in one crucial aspect. He asks for Iago to continue. He demands, If thou love me, show me thy thought, and give thy worst of thoughts the worst of words. So here is the invitation. What Iago's challenge is now is not to lie explicitly, but to change what counts as evidence, and he speaks most deftly. I speak not yet of proof. Look to your wife. Observe her well with Cassio. Wear your eye thus, not jealous nor secure. I would not have your free and noble nature out of self-bounty be abused. Look to it. Iago does not manufacture Othello's weaknesses. He sniffs them out like a bloodhound, and it is from this gentle probing that we learn Othello's love for Desdemona is insecure. Iago goes straight to the heart of it. Desdemona's defiance of her father to marry Othello is now reframed as evidence of disobedience and deceit. She did deceive her father marrying you, and when she seemed to shake and fear your looks, she loved them most. And so she did. The temptation works here not because Iago tells lies, but because he corrupts the truth. Iago then reminds us of her father Brabantio's race-fueled accusations that Othello had seduced Desdemona through the practice of witchcraft, and that she had hidden it all from Brabantio. Why go to, then? She that so young could give out such a seeming to seal her father's eyes up close as oak. He thought 'twas witchcraft. But I am too much to blame. I humbly do beseech you of your pardon for too much loving you. Oh, I am bound to thee for ever. I see this hath a little dashed your spirits. Not a jot, not a jot. I'faith, I fear it has. I hope you will consider what is spoke comes from my love, but I do see you're moved. Iago's lines about excessive love and Othello's sudden low mood usually elicit a dry laugh from most audiences, but his words have hit their mark. Othello's reply, I am bound to thee forever, has a chilling undertone below the surface level expression of gratitude such a statement would usually suggest. It implies that Othello has now tied his happiness, his sense of worth, and whole world view to the interpretation of his life given to him by this disgruntled underling. Unable to resist the racially charged language, Iago again targets this vulnerability further, Othello's blackness in an overwhelmingly white world. As to be bold with you, not to affect many proposed matches of her own clime, complexion, and degree, whereto we see in all things nature tends. One may smell in such a will most rank, foul disproportion, thoughts unnatural. But pardon me. Instead of seeing Desdemona's choice of Othello as the bold and brilliant choice of an independent, spirited young woman suffocated by her overbearing father, Iago chooses to interpret her rejection of many white Venetian suitors in favour of Othello as evidence of a corrupt and unnatural inclination on her part. Her choosing of Othello is presented as an offence against the natural order. This is where race, sexuality, and social hierarchy intersect. Iago exploits Othello's awareness that he is an outsider, Her own climb, complexion, and degree are contrasted with Othello's climb, complexion, and degree. Iago gives Othello's own insecurity a supposedly objective, almost metaphysical explanation. The temptation for Othello therefore becomes not that Desdemona might have betrayed him, but that she was never supposed to love him in the first place. Pride and self-loathing are at war within Othello, as his thinking is warped into, she's too good for me, so of course she's going to cheat on me. Iago then conveniently leaves the room for a moment, and Othello asks the question that all husbands have asked at one point or another: why did I marry? A question that he is no longer able to provide an answer for, because the wheels are turning too fast in his head, and he is now doing Iago's work for him. He goes on to lament the nature of womankind, as he sees it now that he's internalized Iago's view of women. Oh, curse of marriage, that we can call these delicate creatures ours and not their appetites. Again, this reveals much more about Othello than he realizes. His view of women is obviously quite idealized, that women are delicate, somewhat ephemeral creatures, but Iago's view is quite the opposite. In an earlier speech, he says that all women rise to play and go to bed to work. A cuttingly misogynistic remark that encapsulates his whole view of women. In Othello's New World view, notice he zooms in on wives' appetites, not affections or feelings, but appetites. In Iago's worldview, men and women are creatures with insatiable desires for all things: money, power, and most of all, sex. There is no room for feeling, intellect, or love. There is only either a sated appetite or an unsated one. From just a few drops of Iago's poison, Othello begins to emulate Iago's worldview through language. The temptation is succeeding, and Iago knows it because it has become linguistic. Iago has colonized Othello's imagination, heart, and vocabulary. He is once again a slave. Increasingly frustrated and tormented, Othello demands something concrete to substantiate his jealousy. He demands, give me the ocular proof of Desdemona's disloyalty. Much like doubting Thomas, who needed to touch Jesus' wounds to believe, Othello relies entirely on physical tokens and manufactured sights rather than truth and his own love for Desdemona. Othello thinks seeing is believing. He wants revelation. He wants something equivalent to divine certainty, anything to prove my love a whore. But Iago gives him a counterfeit revelation in the form of a strawberry-spotted handkerchief that Desdemona drops by mistake, but is picked up by Iago's wife, Emilia. Othello magnifies the importance of this handkerchief when Desdemona tells him she doesn't have it on her. He uses hyperbolic language to do this. Apparently, an Egyptian gave it to his mother, who, dying, gave it me, and bid me, when my fate would have me wive, to give it her. Apparently, the handkerchief was made by a 200-year-old woman who sewed it out of hallowed silk, and that there is magic in the web of it. This handkerchief was Othello's first gift to Desdemona, so Iago now has the perfect prop to support his falsehoods. The missing handkerchief becomes the hinge upon which Desdemona's fidelity hangs, as he notes so perfectly that trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmation strong as proofs of holy writ. In this moment, Iago perverts religiosity for his own ends. He has created a counterfeit scripture by which Othello will measure the worth of his life by. The description proofs of holy writ suggests something authoritative, sacred, and unquestionable. But the proof is a piece of cloth. I've had many students laugh out loud in class when they realise that Othello's only piece of so-called evidence is a discarded item we would blow our noses into. They scoff and deride him. How could he be so stupid, miss? It's a hanky, I hear them cry. And I must say that they are not alone. Thomas Rymer, an early critic of Othello, hated the play and the device of the handkerchief so much that in 1693 he wrote the following: "So much ado, so much stress, so much passion and repetition about a handkerchief. Why was not this called the tragedy of the handkerchief? What could be more absurd? It is so remote a trifle, no booby could make any consequence from it." It is a cynical and somewhat amusing view, but what Rymer and my students fail to appreciate is that it's not actually about the handkerchief at all. It is that when we are in doubt about something for which we have made ourselves vulnerable, we are desperate for certainty. So when something that resembles certainty comes along, we grab onto it frantically, as it confirms that at least we're not going crazy, or so we tell ourselves, and that we didn't make ourselves vulnerable for nothing. Certainty is, after all, so much more comforting than uncertainty, and this is another mechanism by which temptation operates, exploiting our need for emotional reassurance. The temptation is teetering, and Othello is at a crossroads. Being tempted, though, is not necessarily sinful, but what is morally significant is what happens when you consent to the temptation. And Othello has had a number of opportunities to stop. He could trust Desdemona. He could confront her. He could ask Cassio. He could investigate himself. He could wait. He could refuse to act without hard evidence. Instead, he chooses revenge, hatred instead of love. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate. In the Elizabethan era, a man's public reputation was his most valuable asset, an external marker of his identity. In a patriarchal society, a wife's chastity was directly tied to her husband's public standing. If she cuckolded him, then he becomes a figure of ridicule, both as a husband and as a man. And a wayward wife would have been seen as a clear indicator that a man was both sexually displeasing and lacking control. As a racial and cultural outsider in Venice, Othello is acutely aware of the fragility of his reputation, so the idea of his wife cheating on him makes his tenuous position all the more so. So when he speaks of love yielding up its crown to tyrannous hate, that is a coronation in reverse. Love has been king, and now Othello removes it and installs hatred, as he believes his reputation and standing have been utterly ruined. The language is political, as Othello is now rearranging his whole moral universe. We can ask whether evil isn't simply the presence of something bad, but perhaps it's the displacement of something good. Love isn't destroyed, it is dethroned, and hatred now occupies the throne. At the end of the temptation scene, we witness an astonishing moment. Othello kneels and says, "Now, by yond marble heaven, in the due reverence of a sacred vow, I here engage my words." Iago then joins him on his knees and says, "Witness, you ever-burning lights above, you elements that clip us round about, witness that here Iago doth give up the execution of his wit, hands, heart, to wronged Othello's service. Let him command, and to obey shall be in me remorse what bloody business ever." The sacrilegiousness of this moment is hard to overstate. Aside from being a grotesque inversion of the marriage ceremony that Othello has only just recently had with Desdemona, it is also a perversion of Christianity. Both Othello and Iago use religiously charged language to consecrate the ultimate sin, murder. They are kneeling, making vows, invoking heaven, witnessing each other's promises, using ritual and solemnity to legitimize their horrific plan. And it is after this moment where Othello finally gives Iago the job he craved, and he becomes Othello's lieutenant in Cassio's place. The Christian covenant is that love leads to fidelity, which leads to forgiveness, which leads to reconciliation. The covenant that Othello and Iago make is an almost perfect distortion of that, from suspicion to hatred to revenge to murder. Iago's victory is not making Othello distrust Desdemona, but making Othello trust him instead. In this second anti-marriage with Iago, he has transferred his trust from his wife to the man who wants to destroy him and his wife. But it is at this point that we must remember where the balance of responsibility lies. Iago has orchestrated a sophisticated and believable scenario which Othello has fallen for completely. The puppet master has made his marionette dance, just as he said he would in Act 1, when he plans to set down the pegs that make this music. But what about Othello? Is he merely a passive victim, or are we able to hold him responsible at all for what he says and does next? At this point, Iago can step back. He's got the job he wanted, he's planted the seed, and Othello now decides to be judge, jury, and executioner, quite literally. He positions himself as the arbiter of Desdemona's loyalty. He believes Desdemona has committed adultery, and that adultery deserves nothing less than death at his hands. In the final scene, observing the sleeping Desdemona in the marital bed, Othello gives us one of the most beautiful soliloquies in all of Shakespeare's works, where he likens her life to a light that he must quench, just like the candle he is holding. "Yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. Put out the light, and then put out the light. If I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once put out thy light, thou cunningest pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again, it must needs wither. I'll smell it on the tree. Oh, balmy breath that dost almost persuade justice to break her sword. He is clearly wrestling with himself here, using the metaphors of a rose and a light to signal his understanding of the irrevocability of death. His justification that she must die, else she'll betray more men, is not the language of a jealous husband losing control, but the language of a man who believes he's preventing future evil by becoming a righteous avenger, working on behalf of all mankind to prevent them falling into temptation, just like him. Never mind thou shalt not kill, or the exhortation in Romans, where Paul reminds us that vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Othello sincerely believes that he now has the authority to execute God's vengeance, and Shakespeare makes that frighteningly explicit. Desdemona's murder follows shortly after, and it is a horrifying moment in performance. I have seen countless Othellos, and every single time I wince with shock and horror at seeing this mountain of a man strangle his terrified, diminutive, shrieking wife as she flails desperately on their bed until she stills. When Emilia enters and discovers the lifeless body of her mistress, she lets rip at Othello in an outrageous display of disrespect to someone who is her superior both in rank and social hierarchy. Othello tries to justify his behaviour through religious language and the fears of damnation that were so important in the era, but Emilia is having none of it. She's like a liar gone to burning hell. 'Twas I that killed her. Oh, the more angel she, and you the blacker devil. She turned to folly, and she was a whore. Thou dost belie her, and thou art a devil. She was false as water. Thou art rash as fire to say she was false. Oh, she was heavenly true. Cassio did top her. Ask thy husband else. Oh, I were damned beneath all depth in hell, but that I did proceed upon just grounds to this extremity. Othello seriously thinks he is acting in defence of Christian morality, just grounds, but his entire judgment rests upon a lie. He has believed false testimony, rejected Desdemona's testimony, treated circumstantial evidence as proof, ignored the possibility of his own error, pronounced judgment, imposed a sentence, and carried it out. He has become precisely the kind of private judge that a Christian moral framework ought to prevent. Thomas Aquinas asked whether ignorance makes an act involuntary. Ignorance can excuse where it genuinely deprives someone of the knowledge necessary for voluntary action. But Aquinas distinguishes this from voluntary or culpable ignorance, where someone fails to know something they could and should have known, or even deliberately avoids knowledge because knowing the truth would interfere with what they want to do. Othello doesn't lack access to the truth. He has closed himself to it and chooses to murder his wife and then justify it afterwards. The fact he made the choice matters because sin requires the will, and Othello has had lots of opportunities to turn back, but he didn't. But the presumption of God's authority is not Othello's greatest sin, arguably. It is that he sinned willingly, whilst honestly believing he was doing the right thing. Macbeth sinned, knowing full well he was doing so, but Othello's sin is far worse because he believes he's doing good, and that is utterly horrifying, for there is nothing such a person will not justify in the name of goodness. Can his actions be, if not excused, then at least explained as being the result of relentless targeted provocation and deceit? Does being manipulated make you innocent of what you subsequently choose to do? Shakespeare's answer would appear to be a resounding no. At the end, when Othello comes to the horrible realization he has been manipulated, his anagnorisis, Desdemona's lifeless body is a kind of rebuke to him as he says to her, "When we shall meet at Compt, this look of thine will hurl my soul from heaven, and fiends will snatch at it. Whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight. Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulphur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire." The word Compt is an abbreviation of the word account, in other words, the day of judgment. His realization that he will forever be separated from God because of his error is a moment of great pathos. He will be torn apart by devils for eternity for the gravity and horror of his crime. His hyperbolic language uses all the imagery of hell with which we are still familiar, sulphurous fumes, and the flames of hell tormenting him for his mortal sin. And then, finally, we get to the ultimate question of this play that Othello asks 5 acts later, after all the pain, outrage, hurt, jealousy, tears, and death. He finally asks, "Will you, I pray, demand that demi-devil? Why? He hath thus ensnared my soul and body." Demand me nothing. What you know, you know. From this time forth, I never will speak word. Iago's answer is absolutely maddening. No explanation, no apology, and no motivation given. And this response of his has foxed scholars and audiences for 4 centuries. Why did he do it? What was it all for? And why does it all seem so petty somehow? If Iago's tempting behaviour is Satan-like, then why doesn't Shakespeare give him a motivation worthy of Satan? At least the devil aimed high, wanting to undermine the whole of God's creation after being flung out of heaven for his ambition. Iago's laundry list of grievances seems rather modest in comparison. First, it's Cassio's promotion to the job he wanted. Then it's because he suspects his own wife has been unfaithful with Othello. Add in a few dashes of racism, class resentment, and misogyny, and his motivation becomes exceptionally difficult to track. Coleridge famously described Iago as having a motiveless malignity, which brings us to the most frightening question of all. What if he really has no motive? What if all the racism, class resentment, vulgarity, misogyny, spite, and pettiness is just who he is? Perhaps the reason we are fascinated by evil is because we desperately want it to be separate from us. Think about when you turn on the news and see yet another atrocity has been perpetrated somewhere by an angry, violent man. People desperately wish to ascribe an understandable motive so we can safely file them away under the heading of deranged and broken human being. How many times have we heard the excuses, oh, he was a lone wolf, or he struggled with alcohol and mental health, or he missed his medication, and of course that perennial favourite, he had a rough childhood. We want the serial killer, dictator, abuser, or Iago to be completely different from us, so that we can sleep easy at night, safe in the knowledge that such people are nothing like us, and that we could never be capable of that. But that is a comforting lie that we tell ourselves. For if evil really required extraordinary or broken people, we could safely distance ourselves from it. We're lightning quick to try to pigeonhole such people as defective, but what if they are not? What can we do with such a person? And what does our inability to cope with such an idea say about us? When Hannah Arendt attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the final solution, she expected to encounter a true monster. Instead, she encountered something she found much more disturbing, a man who appeared astonishingly ordinary, whose crimes were associated not with some supernatural capacity for wickedness, nor raging anti-Semitism, but with what she called his thoughtlessness, his failure to think and judge independently. And this resulted in the famous "the banality of evil" quote. Evil is not monstrous, it is often methodical and very calm. Iago is certainly no Eichmann, and Shakespeare's tragedy is obviously on an entirely different scale, but Shakespeare understands something about the mechanism by which evil works. Iago does not need to make Othello evil, he only needs to make him stop thinking for himself. Iago supplies the interpretation, Othello supplies the conclusion. He turns suspicion into certainty, certainty into judgment, and judgment into murder. And that may be the most frightening thing about Othello. Othello does not become a monster before our eyes. He remains, almost until the end, the man he believes himself to be, an honourable soldier administering justice to a guilty woman. The horror lies precisely in the gap between what Othello is doing and what he believes he is doing. Christianity gives us one way of describing the process, temptation. Arendt gives us another, the failure to think for oneself. Shakespeare gives us the tragedy that occurs when the two converge. Iago's greatest achievement is therefore not that he makes Othello evil, it is that he makes evil seem so very, very reasonable. Thank you very much. I shall see you on the chat.